Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of 6 Days in Suez. My name is Nicolas, and I'll be your host today. This is going to be a really exciting episode. But first, I would like to thank you again for listening and for being more and more with us. And please, if you enjoyed the podcast, don't forget to give us a star on Spotify. It really means a lot for us and for our visibility. Now, today we've got a special topic to discuss and a very special guest as well. As you know, we're living in a unique moment with the new US administration. In short, we're seeing big changes in global trade policy, new tariff, more enforcement, more tensions, more barriers, and even the rising risk of trade wars. So today, we would like to take a step back and explore actually a very big question. How does this new administration impact the trade compliance world? And by trade compliance world, by the way, we mean the professionals and companies that have to navigate all those changes. To help us answer this important but not easy question, I have the great pleasure of welcoming Erika Trujillo. I will let Erika introduce herself, but I can already say this to answer today's question, today's big question. We needed someone with a really strong and diverse trade compliance background in industry, in consulting, in government, in IT systems, and because everything that's happening now needs to be addressed from multiple angles. And the objective today is to capture all those impacts. So our guests today bring all that experience. That's why we're really lucky to have Erika with us today. Erika, thanks again for being there for this episode. May I ask you to introduce yourself to the audience, please?
Hi, Nicholas. Thank you so much for inviting me to be on this podcast. I think you guys cover so many really good, practical, deep topics here, and I am really looking forward to taking a deep dive into the topics today in terms of trade compliance and really focusing on how we can find solutions. I think a lot of us have been focused very much on the challenges of trade compliance and the challenges of global trade, but I think it's great that we can also focus on the light at the end of the tunnel and some of the innovations and solutions that we on the trade compliance side of the industry are looking to bring. And in that regard, a little bit about myself. As you said, my name is Erika Trujillo. I like to think I have had this 360-degree view of international trade. As you said, I've had the government side. I've been a trade compliance officer in the German automotive industry myself. I've also been a lawyer in this topic and a consultant. I would say kind of my niche over the past decade or so has been on multi-jurisdictional export controls and sanctions compliance. So how can you really deal with a lot of these conflicting regulatory interests in an organized and resilient way? And at the same time, how can we leverage trade compliance to really add business value instead of just being this little cost center somewhere in a basement? And I think as we dive into the topic today, we're going to really start to see how that shift towards more strategic thinking is really playing out in the trade compliance space. So thank you so much again for inviting me to be here today.
Thanks a lot, Erika. And this is exactly why we need you today for this very important topic. And I'm sure it's going to be the first episode, but not the last one together, because I think what you explain is so well put. What we need now is not questions or challenges; it's answers, right? And so let's try to do it today. Thanks again, Erika, for being with us. So I would kick it off with a first question, which is actually a very large question, but we need to start. And I will start with this very practical question. As I've mentioned into the introduction, we're seeing unprecedented changes in global trade policy due to the new US administration. Um, how this new reality fundamentally is changing what trade compliance teams need to succeed.
Yeah, as you say, this is a big question, but I think if I had to sum it all up into one word, I would say information. right? And I think that's really where we can take this from a few different perspectives. The first is, of course, information about our own business. I think that's something that a lot of trade compliance organizations and businesses were lacking, was the operational oversight of really what business they're doing and having that understanding of the supply chain, really understanding their products. We saw a huge impetus in a lot of trade compliance organizations to identify whether they had, for example, high priority items that were now subject to Russia sanctions over the past few years, or really trying to get information about who their business partners are and what kind of business those partners are engaged in to really understand those supply chain impacts in regards to sanctions and export controls risks. And on the other side of this, we're starting to need more information about the rate of change in the regulations themselves. We've gone through some very high stress times where every single week we're getting new regulations coming out or new rules that we need to comply with. And the role of the trade compliance officer is really playing that middleman between understanding the policy change, understanding how that then becomes regulations we need to comply with, and then applying that to our daily business, and then informing the business leadership or operations of what changes we need to make. So being able to have that information about where the industry is going, where the regulations are going, is also something that's become hugely critical to trade compliance operations, but more so hugely critical to the business itself, being able to come to trade compliance, get that information, and adapt accordingly. So I know that's a very long answer for one word of information, but I would say that's really where the new reality is fundamentally changing what trade compliance need at a level we didn't have in the past. I remember 15 years ago, our job was to make sure that we had all the policies and procedures written up and in the drawer, and that was the goal, right? And now we're in a point of time where we have to be those strategic advisors to our senior leadership. We have to be informing the business, and for that, we need a whole lot of information.
Thanks a lot, Erika. And I was going to ask you if you could give a concrete example of something that trade compliance teams used to prioritize, but that no longer works in today's environment, as you perfectly put. So you mentioned something around the regulations. Do you have other examples, or when you think about how compliance teams were working, used to work, that is today no longer applicable?
Yeah, I would say there's maybe two things that immediately come to mind. So the first is compliance to the bar of the legal minimum. So back in the day, we used to say, okay, here's the absolute legal minimum level that we need to achieve to have said, hey, we did what we were supposed to do if our auditor comes knocking. And as long as we could kind of get ourselves to that baseline, for many organizations, that was enough. We are now in a point in time where if we're only building programs to meet a specific legal minimum, if that bar changes day to day, it really has a huge impact on our organization. So I would say the first fundamental example I can give is that we are now shifting to a much more proactive mindset and building more resilient trade compliance programs based around things like a policy approach that's often a little bit above the legal minimum, just so that we have more stability in our business operations. So that would be the first, is moving from baseline legal minimums to much more proactive, policy-driven trade compliance programs. And I would say the second example of how we've kind of shifted our mentality is moving towards something that I like to call the assurance layer in trade compliance. So we kind of think about the trade compliance program in three levels. The bottom level is the operational level. That's doing trade compliance. And we used to spend a lot of time, making sure that we had all of these tools and processes to do classification, to determine whether we need licenses or authorizations from the government to engage in certain kinds of trade. That was really the doing of trade compliance. And that's where we put a lot of our focus on digitalization and automation. On top of that, we have the program layer. That's the policies, procedures, people, training and awareness. And that was a good chunk of our time as well. And in the past, this top layer, the assurance layer, doing things like risk assessments or understanding whether our control gates are actually working, took a bit of a back seat to a lot of the other operations we had. And I would say we've seen quite a big shift towards putting more focus on the assurance layer to say, where are the gaps in my operational processes? Where do I have core risk exposure? Because this shift allows us to be much more efficient in prioritizing what we do with our time and reducing some of that manual workload from before. Because as you mentioned, we have so many challenges coming up every single day. It's very easy to kind of get distracted every day by the new shiny thing. So I think this is really that second shift that we have, is towards saying, how can we build a strong assurance layer that our trade compliance programs are working appropriately so that we can prioritize appropriately what new shiny thing is actually most important from my organization from a risk-based approach.
Amazing. And I mean, I will go back and come back to the topic of today, but I have hundreds of other questions based on
Please.
what you. I'm just going to share one question. What's your views on the way companies should handle this insurance layer, this third layer? Do they have to internalize it? Do they have to externalize? Do they have to bring new systems? I don't know. What's your views on that?
So I am obviously a little bit biased because I spend way too many hours of my day thinking about this exact topic. This has kind of consumed my life for the past 3 years. But in my view, what we really need is to take a digital approach to this assurance layer, because what we've seen over the past, 2 decades is a move towards automation, a move towards digital transformation within our organizations. So if our business processes are becoming more digital, our oversight capabilities also need to become more digital, because as a human being, I'm not able to see this full scope of all the business activities that are happening through all these digital processes. So in my view, making this assurance layer something that is data driven and that works for our trade compliance organization is really critical to keeping up with the business organization, but also keeping up with the pace of international trade. So that digitalization element for me is non-negotiable if we're talking about a modern trade compliance organization. And maybe I can give a little bit of an analogy here. When I talk to my trade compliance officer friends and colleagues, I always like to ask them this question of, who do you see yourself as in your organization, in your role as a trade compliance officer? And I get a lot of different answers. Everything from, I'm the knight in shining armor that defends the company, to, I'm like a SWAT team that goes out and eliminates risks, to, someone feels like the firefighter, or they're the oracle with the crystal ball trying to predict the future. I get a lot of these different questions. But I always like to say that in trade compliance, we're kind of like farmers, right? There's so many things we can't control, like, the weather or the soil conditions. There's a lot of chaos going on around us, but we have to be the ones that come in with these very organized approaches of, getting the compliance foundations ready, tilling the soil, organizing, and doing everything that we can to protect our business so that it can be successful and lead to harvest, right? So to some extent, I think we're the farmers that just have to go out and work hard every day. Now, that being said, if you're going to be a modern farmer, you can't be sitting there with your little, metal shovel or your little hoe trying to till the soil manually. That just doesn't work if you're trying to keep up with the modern economy of farming. And this is why we see so many of these big, impressive machines and technologies that go into that kind of thing today. So I think this is the mentality to some extent we need to take as trade compliance organizations, is to say, that extra special tool for farming, it's not just a luxury. That is a necessity to keep up with the demands that we have. And I think the same is true of trade compliance. If we're going to keep up with the demands, from geopolitics, from a digitalizing business organization, we need to have the data and the tools to leverage that data to just keep up with our job as modern trade compliance farmers.
Coming from a family of farmers, I love this analogy. Now, I don't know if next time I have a family dinner, I can say, guys, hey, you know what I'm doing in my life? I'm like you. I'm not so sure they would they would love it, but I love this analogy. And thanks a lot, Erika, because it brings a lot of new perspective. And by the way, if you know also more, like you said, also the farmer industry, IT systems are everywhere now. So I think we can also continue the comparison here. And no, thanks a lot. And coming back more to the U.S. trade policy topic, and taking more also, I would say, at scale, because this is also what you mentioned when you presented yourself, the fact that, which is from my perspective, something that a very limited number of experts have, this expertise on multiple jurisdiction. And that's actually the question I wanted to raise to you now is basically from your perspective, how companies should approach compliance, trade compliance, when they have to deal with this multi-jurisdictional complexity. And of course, with the big countries being China, Canada, Mexico, of course, the US. What's your perspective on that when you trade compliance managers, for example, have to handle multiple jurisdictions as part of their scope of operations?
Yeah, I think that's the core challenge that most people are facing. And I remember, 15 years ago, it was very unusual to have people doing both. You had your US lawyers sitting somewhere in DC maybe, and then you had your European operations and they were doing something very different. Now I'm starting to see so many more professionals that really have this multi-jurisdictional view on these regulations because you have to. It is the only way of working at this point in time. And when dealing with those complexities, on the one hand, you absolutely need to be aware of the US, certainly. But at the same time, we can't overlook the local complexities. So I think especially large multinationals often forget the local jurisdictions and some of the unique nuances. So I'm based in Munich in Germany. Anyone that's worked with BAFA knows BAFA is a beast of its own. So I think it's really important to make sure that your organizations have that balance of expertise. At the top, I think you definitely need a jack of all trades. I think you need someone who understands the legal theories overall running trade compliance and how to kind of manage that from a balanced perspective. But then on the other side, you're going to need more local expertise. So some companies do this in-house. A lot of companies actually need to seek external counsel, either in terms of law firms or, of course, I think consultants are great as well for this because they have that operational experience. So I would almost recommend have your jack of all trades in-house dealing with the multi-jurisdictional perspective, and then make sure you have very in-depth experts for each of those jurisdictions that you're operating in. Because I think this is one of the big pitfalls we see is also not being able to understand when you have a risk in certain areas. And I can give you a practical example of this. We just had our 2025 Think Lab where we bring together a bunch of top trade compliance experts to really brainstorm over certain topics. And we always share some of the top trends and insights that we see across all of our client base, across all of the industries. What are the big pitfalls everyone is dealing with? And the number one that we shared this year was US re-export issues. So we see all the time across all industries, companies that in their product material master data, they have items that are indicated as being US origin, but then they're missing that US export controls classification number. And the problem is if you're missing an ECCN, your whole US re-export license determination process usually just doesn't happen because that's not how the tools in your operational layer are built. So that's an example where very small master data issues can actually have huge regulatory impact, and you might be fundamentally overlooking an area of multi-jurisdictional complexity on a transaction, not because you're lazy or not because you don't want to deal with it, but you just don't know. And again, I think this goes back to this point of the assurance layer and why it needs to be data driven, because when we're dealing with these multi-jurisdictional risks, we also need to have systems that are able to capture multi-jurisdictional risk exposure and maybe catch some of those issues that are not immediately obvious to us.
And when you have to manage this challenge of multi-jurisdiction, you can also face the challenge of different enforcements, if I can put it like that, right? Because as you know, it's a question of culture, sometimes a question of trade compliance, regulations, enforcement. How do you deal with that when you have to handle, let's say, the globe, like the world? Um, I guess also this is a question of risk-based management. What's your views on that when in some jurisdictions, let's say, you have a certain regulation, but you know it's not going to be enforced in the same way as, for example, in the US? How do you deal with that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I mean, maybe when I can start first with the US and then maybe look at the other perspective. So, from the US side, people often forget that US export controls and sanctions enforcement, it's not like getting a parking ticket in the mail, right? There are real people that are physically present here in Europe or in other jurisdictions in the world that are representing the US regulators. So for example, on the US re-export topic, one of my colleagues from our Think Lab just told me that they had a meeting in Italy recently where a BIS representative mentioned the fact that at least 85% of European companies miss US re-export issues. So, I mean, I think we can take a few things away from this. Number one, that's a problem that is actually quite widespread that most companies are not aware of. Secondly, there's BIS representatives in Italy. And that's the thing people often forget. There's quite a few of them over in Frankfurt as well, or in London. So I think this is something that when people are dealing with multi-jurisdictional topics, the traditional European paradigm was, we manage our territory here in Europe, the US, maybe we have to think about that, but that's somewhere else. We forget that that's very much here as well. And on the flip side, when we're talking about the differences in enforcement, I think this is, again, pointing to why it's so important to have the right expertise, either in-house or externally, to get a feeling for actually what are the risks that you're dealing with. Not all jurisdictions are created equal, as I think we can see. Of course, the French authorities, the Italian authorities are maybe more conservative when it comes to their trade compliance enforcement. However, it doesn't mean that those companies have nothing to worry about, because they do need to be thinking about how interconnected global trade is. So even if you're in France, you might still have an element that's related to BAFA. Even if you're in Italy, you might still have that US re-export problem. So I think it's, again, finding that balance of expertise and really getting a strong understanding of what your risk exposure is based on your business.
Thanks a lot, Erika. And what makes it even more difficult is the lack of sometimes stability, especially right now. The Trump administration policies seem to change frequently. I don't know if we have to say right now where we stand because it's changing on a regular basis, right? In terms of tariff. I would say now we are recording this episode on the 17th of September. I think it's more or less pretty stable, even if I think we had a recent news on Japan, but and India, etc. So I think it's moving, and that's the idea of what happened for the last months. And in this environment, from your views, how companies can move from, I think you already mentioned that, from reactive compliance to a truly risk-based approach. What do they have to perform as transformative activities to basically be more aligned with this new environment?
Yeah, I would say this comes back to these two ideas of information and monitoring. So the first is information, and this is really what we work on every day with our customers is saying, okay, how can we get a holistic overview of what's going on in the business, first of all, so you actually have information. So if that regulation changes tomorrow and suddenly there's a whole new list of HS codes that are subject to restrictions, you're not scrambling to figure out if you even have those products. You can immediately identify, okay, here's our high priority items, right? Now, what do we do? So getting that baseline information is a critical starting point to have up-to-date information every single day about your business so that I'm not spending the next 3 weeks trying to understand what the impact of these changes is. I get to spend the next 3 weeks actually solving those problems, whether that's, again, internal solving the problems, or I now have a very clear question or task that I can take to my external consultants and say, hey, we identified this is the impact of these new changes. This is the business that's going to be affected. How do we now manage this? I want to spend my time and resources managing, not just having to identify problems and understand impact. So information first. And the second is then, of course, the monitoring element. We're human beings. I think the one thing that is universal across the trade industry is how hard everyone is working. This is a very thankless job, and really people only get identified when something goes wrong. So these are not people that are in this job just because it's loads of fun every day. They're people that really care about their organizations and they're working very, very hard. But we're still human beings. There's only so many things we can see and identify, and we're dealing with our own psychological biases. I only know what I know, and I can only ask the question that I know I need to be asking. So this is where, again, I think the digital transformation in terms of our ability to monitor for risks is hugely beneficial because it's going to offset my psychological biases and help me identify things I didn't think to look for. And it's also going to identify things that I wouldn't be able to see, but my auditor definitely could. Yeah, so I think a really good example of this from the work that we do is maybe on two sides. One is going to be our ability to prioritize proactively. So for example, if I start to see certain trends in my risk exposure that are all centered around a specific location or a specific team, I now know instead of wasting my week doing general training, I can go specifically train those people in exactly the risk exposure area that's causing a business issue. So now I'm having the biggest impact possible with the least amount of effort. And I'm also creating that trust with the business that I'm really there to support them. Maybe another example of this is there's information all across the organization that is indicative of risk, and being able to pull those things together and connect the dots is often quite challenging. So for example, we've had clients that in their own Salesforce system, they've identified a military end user in China, but their trade compliance process never considered this for export and authorization processes. And this is a really good example because you're liable for that data. It's internal data you already know. We have collective knowledge that this is potentially going to a military end user, but that's not something trade compliance is aware of. So I think being able to connect the dots holistically across the organization and say, hey, let's double check this transaction because based on your own internal information, we think you might have a Chinese military end user. That's a great example of shifting to a more proactive approach as opposed to just, after the fact, your auditor is sitting there and telling you, hey, you shipped to a military end user.
And then what does it mean for you in terms of in-house trade compliance manager profiles that are needed now? What you just perfectly explained on the fact that basically we need farmers, but also we need people that will know where are the data, they will know how to use it. And I think it's also, I don't know what you think about that, but it's a shift as well in terms of mindset. I would even say soft skills of the trade compliance managers we need. What's your views on that?
Oh, Nicholas, I always love speaking to you about these things because I think you've got it exactly right. Um, we need a variety of insights, and this might be in one person, it might be in many people in the team, but you've absolutely listed them out. So the first I think is at least an awareness of data. I don't think all of us in trade compliance need to be data scientists ourselves, although we have seen a growing number of trade compliance teams hiring a data scientist to support their operations. But we need to have an understanding of what data is and where it comes from. Because for too long, people have said, oh, well, we have bad data, we can't do anything. And yet they then rely on that bad data to make very serious legal declarations to the government every day. We need to have an understanding of where our data is coming from, how it flows through our organization, how it impacts our regulatory risk exposure. It's not good enough to just ignore data. We need to approach data as a risk that needs to be solved and managed for our organizations. So the first profile is absolutely, we need to have a data awareness, or at least less fear towards technical topics, because that's the future of business. And the second, as you've absolutely rightfully pointed out, is a change in how we critically think about trade compliance. And this is one of the things we see very often in the training and operationalization that we do with our customers, is having them switch from this mindset of, can I come up with absolutely any excuse as to why this could be a valid scenario, and if yes, ignore it, to, I need to be a data detective. I need to be investigating, what does this mean for my organization? And part of this is, we've been so reliant on technical tools like screening solutions, where, the job is to sit there and say, is it a positive hit, yes or no? And you just go, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. And now we're shifting into a much more critical thinking space, where maybe the answer is, well, this particular scenario on that transaction was legal, but it points out to me a systemic problem that I need to address. So for example, if I have an organization that's sending a dual use item without a license in my transactional data, maybe that's something that I look at it and I say, okay, well, it's a dual use item. It's going to Switzerland from Germany. That's fine. It's not illegal. I'm just going to, go report this, in my biannual ELA and K2 report. Fine, fine, fine. It's legal. But you have a transaction that's a dual use item that's being exported without a license in your data. How is that possible? And that's the switch we need to think, is not just yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. Is it legal? Is it not legal? We need to train people to understand these systemic problems that these kind of fires tell us about. This tells me I have a license determination problem. I have a data problem. Because what if tomorrow that dual use item isn't going to Switzerland? What if it's going to China? What if it's going to Iran? Is my system going to catch that? And that's that shift that I think we're making, is towards really plugging the holes in the program instead of just mopping up all the water every day. And it sounds obvious, but in practice, it does require a certain amount of training to think that way. But once we do that, we also become much better business partners for our leadership and for our organizations, because we're really able to have that strategic view and be more proactive thinking and say, okay, this is what we need to do to stabilize our business going forward.
I love what you said about, okay, you have to sometimes report a problem, but you have to fix it, right? And it always makes me think also around US anti-boycott regulations, which is also, you have an obligation to report when you spot boycott language, as we call it, but also very often you need to handle, okay, how can I fix this problem on a structural basis? And I'm not going to give any name, but I had so many experience where basically you had to handle this obligation of reporting. But then, of course, you need to handle this potentially with your freight forwarder, because on the shipping document, this is where you see a lot of boycott language or that kind of things. It takes time, it takes energy for sure, but for sure, if not, basically you repeat always the same problems, and the idea is, of course, to come with structural solutions. So no, that's clear. And I
Maybe
wanted
we're just
to, yeah,
lazy. I just
please.
want to solve a problem once. I
No,
don't want to solve the same problem 10 times.
I think it's a question of mindset at the end of the day, and that's something we see very often there is a shift of potentially, I don't like to say that. And by the way, we had a podcast on that, an episode on that, on shift of generation, potentially as well in the trade compliance world. I don't really like to say that because it means that people being a bit older are not fit for the world, this is something I don't believe at all. It's more a question of mindset, I would say. Let's put it like that, a change of mindset, and like you perfectly explain, a change of approach. But yeah, that's for us in trade compliance. Because by nature we are connected to operations, right? And that's why basically at the end of the day, it's not just a structural solution that we have to bring. I mean, this is what we have to bring combined with the operations. I wanted to ask you a concrete question. I really, when you spoke about Salesforce and saying, okay, actually, you don't know, but you have amazing data somewhere in your company. Would you have any other concrete example you could share to the audience saying, guys, actually, to do your trade compliance work in-house, you have to use data. You have data, for example, in Salesforce, but in other ERP or whatever database, could you give some examples what you may have seen also with your clients where you could capture data that would be very important for the trade compliance program?
Absolutely. So what we do at SEIA is really kind of meeting the companies where they're at in terms of what data do they have and what kind of operations are they doing. So what holistic data makes sense for your trade compliance organization could be completely different from someone else. But I can give a few examples. Of course, there's the big ERP system, right? That's where you have most of your master data, your transactional information. That's all going to be a core element of data. Who are your business partners? You know, what value are you selling products for? What kind of products do you have? That's all critical base information. We then typically augment that from a few other sources, one of which is maybe an SAP GTS or whatever trade management system that companies are using. We've even had customers where that's done in Excel spreadsheets, and we need to pull in Excel spreadsheet data and compare it maybe to the master data in the ERP system, but really kind of understanding what the trade flow data is, what licenses are using, what export controls classification numbers do you have, what is your process supposed to look like. And then that's when we start to get into the fun part of what we do at SEIA. And that's like, where's all the other good data? And this is something that I had personally when I was a trade compliance officer. I was in automotive, and I found that some of the best transactional data for my trade compliance purposes were either sitting in conflict minerals team. They had great supply chain information, which was very interesting from a sanctions perspective. Or oddly enough, Binman. We had this little system that helped us return empty boxes from the OEMs. And sometimes our Binman system had better transactional data than our actual transactional data. So for me, that was kind of an eye-opener back in the day to say, hey, wait a minute, if all this good data is sitting out in my company, what else is there? And so this really sparked what we now do with our customers to say, okay, what sources of data or information do you have that could be really helpful from a risk indication perspective? For some clients, if they're heavily operating in a software space, for example, it could be something as simple as IP download locations. Why do you have a customer in Turkey, but your product is being downloaded in Iran? That's a huge risk indicator, of course, for sanctions and export controls compliance. Sometimes it's companies in defense and aerospace, maybe they want to look at their Concur travel data. If their sales guy's booking a flight to Saudi tomorrow, the chances that they have an export license for that prototype are very low. So maybe you want to know who's booking travel where in some of these very high risk scenarios. For other companies, it can be things like access restrictions. You know, why do you have certain people accessing things that they shouldn't be accessing? So there's a lot of information that's incredibly insightful in this direction. And at the end of the day, I always remember a great example from one of our compliance colleagues. His name is Charles Perret, and I always call this the Charles Perret Index because he said, you know, one of the best indicators of risk for him in ethics and compliance was employee turnover rates. Because if you have a really high employee turnover rate in a certain location, it tells you one of two things. One, something bad is happening and that's why everyone is leaving. Or two, you have a lot of new people, so they're not really well trained yet. So they're more likely to make a mistake because they just don't have that experience. And that for me was just such a light bulb in the philosophy of what we do to say, hey, that's a great indicator, because maybe the same person that pays a bribe, doesn't use an export license, or, the same untrained people from ethics and compliance perspective also don't know how to comply with sanctions and export controls processes. So these are the kind of things that we need to be looking for, is what are the indicators sitting elsewhere in our organization that when we connect it to the information we know in trade compliance, suddenly becomes really insightful and actionable.
That's why also when companies are doing transformation projects like mergers, acquisitions, this is also a very tricky moment and very dangerous moment, let's put it like this, from a trade compliance point of view. We've seen also many layoffs in some industries, which from a trade compliance point of view can be really risky. And like you perfectly mentioned, can be an indicator of, oh, something could be very wrong here from a compliance point of view. And to continue on this topic, what we sometimes forget is that data they are dynamic, right? So at the end of the day, when we look at compliance issues, very often it's because a data has changed. And due very often to supply chain changes, products can change, composition can change, clients, suppliers. So what I wanted to ask you is about basically how companies and of course professionals should take into consideration this element, and how basically they can adapt potentially their way of doing the things to make sure they can spot when any key modification happen, and basically they can spot, I think you already mentioned, red flags. What advice you would give here to the audience to, I would not say avoid completely that kind of risk, but at least to put in place uh, an organization that would prevent them to happen on a regular basis?
Oh, this is where data analytics becomes absolutely invaluable, because you can really start to spot some of those changes, whether they're accidental or intentional or just the change of the business. So, for example, classification, right? If suddenly you're able to compare and say, hey, how come we have one material number in this jurisdiction that has this classification, but in another jurisdiction, the same exact material has a completely different classification? And I mean, of course, there are some regional country differences in maybe the last digits, but it shouldn't be a fundamentally different product, right? That's a kind of comparison that can be really insightful, especially if one of those classifications is regarding a HS code that's a high priority item for Russia. It's magically changed to not being a high priority item only in Indonesia, and Indonesia happens to still have some Russia business or Kazakhstan business, something like this. Suddenly that becomes really interesting. So I think these data changes are something that's almost impossible for a human being trade compliance officer to monitor for and check for. And even if you were monitoring and checking for them, what are you looking for? Does it actually mean anything? And this is where I always have a problem with pure data reporting. It can be interesting, but it doesn't usually inform me of anything specific. So this is where advanced data analytics is absolutely critical, because you can monitor for these kinds of data changes, but put it in the context of why this is relevant. So you have that US origin item missing a US ECCN, and it always happens on this particular route. Now that tells me here's a very specific problem that I can address. Or here's suddenly we have a huge deviation in the valuation of a product that's being exported. Why is that, right? So we always have a valuation issue in a specific plant. Maybe now I know I need to do some training there or figure out why that's happening. So this is where, to answer your question simply, we must have data analytics that has the capability to monitor what we cannot, and has the ability to contextualize that information for us so it's actually informative from a risk perspective.
Thanks a lot, Erika. So in other words, it's not something you have to do on on a manual basis, or that you have only to rely on people. When I share that to community or colleagues, peers, or clients, there is always a woo. What do you mean by we don't need individuals? I don't mean we need to automate everything. It's just the full process should not base on someone. Because if this person is leaving, then what do we do? The process, the foundation, as you perfectly mentioned, should be the system at the end of the day, and the data analytics. And but
Oh, and
coming,
data analytics, maybe before we move on,
yeah,
just to make
sure,
the point really
please.
clear, data analytics are designed for the user. And I think that's also a big change is, when I was a trade compliance officer, I had all the tools. I had the classification tools, I had the license determination tools, I had, the GTS systems and all of these things. And that's
I'm
great.
sorry.
I know. They're really important. They're foundational tools. I think we even had like 8 different versions of them spread across 37 different ERP systems. And those were important things, but none of those tools were designed to help me, the human being user, in answering questions. Are those systems working? What is actually important? What do I need to do? And where is the information that I need to support my decision making? And that's that gap between operational tools, systems, and processes, and this kind of assurance risk management concept. And you're absolutely right. This does not in any way negate the need for users. In fact, we need better users. We need good, smart people who are going to say, hey, how can I take this information and then go move on with it? One of my colleagues has the analogy that we used to spend a lot of time looking for the needle in the haystack. I don't know if you also have this saying, but kind of with advanced data analytics, what you do is you send the giant magnet over the pile, all the little needles come up. So you can now spend time sewing or crafting, whatever it is you were supposed to do, instead of searching around. And I think that's the shift. You still need someone to go sew and do the trade compliance, but they're spending their time effectively.
Mm. This is a perfect transition to my next question, Erika, on that is more on people and more on managers. Um, no need to say and to repeat that trade compliance managers are now on the front line. I would even say front line of the news. Compliance teams and professionals are under pressure. By the way, they have always been under pressure. Maybe now what's different is the intensity and the scale. But let's say it's not easy today to be a trade compliance in-house manager. And they have to speak very often, more and more, especially with what happened recently with the tariff increase, to the top management. And this top management can be the supply chain leadership team if they report to supply chain or tax or whatever, or it can also be to the board very often when, of course, there is big risk ahead. I wanted to ask you just a question also with your background as in-house leader. Now, I would say on the other side of the table, but what's your views on basically what trade compliance managers, considering this specific environment, have to develop to be maybe more heard at the leadership table? Can you share to us some thoughts around that, and what would be I would say, the best practice as well when they have to talk to the top management?
Nicolas, you're always so on point. I was just having this conversation exactly with a trade compliance colleague and friend of mine, Beth Ann Johnson, because she's a huge proponent of training. And she really talks about something that I've now come to call training out. So we often train other departments in trade compliance, but we often lack our own training in what are the priorities of those business departments. What are the top priorities of sales? What are the top priorities of leadership? How do we communicate with them in their language, not just, giving them the trade compliance message? And I think the way that some of these organizations do the best practices in training for trade compliance officers, they're doing a lot of training out. They train them in communication skills specifically for the C-suite. What are the messages that are important at that level? How do you keep it concise? Maybe I'm the worst person to tell anyone about being concise, but how can you keep your message concise? Because some of my colleagues, when they present to the board, they get 6 minutes, like literally timed 6 minutes. So I think that's really where you have to be able to come in with very specific information. You have to come in with a proactive understanding of what the impact is on the business, and you have to have solutions, because there's nothing a C-suite hates more than somebody coming to them with a problem with no concept of a solution. So we've been talking about information throughout the entire discussion. Once again, you need good information and you need to add value. So this is something where I wish there was better soft skill training programs for trade compliance officers, not just in terms of delivering that C-suite message, but overall business communication. How do you make the case for trade compliance internally? If that's talking to a sales team, if that's talking to R&D, if that's talking to leadership, those soft skills are often lacking. And that's the difference between, someone who's great at trade compliance and a really good trade compliance officer. You have to bridge the gap, and you have to get that importance of the message through to the right people, or in the end, it doesn't really matter. So absolutely, if you have any recommendations on anyone doing soft skill training for trade compliance officers, send me that info, because I know quite a few people that would be interested.
Oh yeah, I think the trade compliance managers are the worst to share bad news. The problem, we only sharing bad news. You never go to speak to the board to share a good news in trade compliance. Or you share a good news if you have fixed what was a bad news a couple of months ago.
Yeah.
And this is very often where, like you perfectly put it, there is a question of soft skills. There is a question of, okay, go to the point. And also something that an element that we often forget is that as a trade compliance responsible, you need also to understand the company's culture you are into. Because very often we believe, okay, we are trade compliance managers. I go to the automotive industry or I go to the textile industry. It's going to be the same job. I can tell you, and I'm sure you can confirm, Erika, it's not the same at all, because as we are in the middle of every department, the company's culture, we will feel it, right? And we need to get it. We need to capture the essence of this culture, and we need to be able to, when we share, especially message to the management, we need to keep that in mind. And it's all about, of course, business objective, and because that's, and I'd like to get your views on that, Erika. Where sometimes I'm a bit, I wouldn't say pissed off. I'm just, guys, think about where you are. We forget that we are here, let's put it like that, to make money. You are an employee, you work in a company. Why you here? Okay, maybe you are a trade compliance responsible, but at the end of the day, why you here? You here to sustain a certain business, right? And I'm always, it's great, like you mentioned, you have some people, they consider themselves as cops in-house, you know. But sometimes I'm also, guys, it's not that you have to go out of the law or to have any infringement. It's not the point. It's just keep in mind that you have to serve the business, right? That's the main objective. What's your views on that?
I think one of our trade compliance colleagues, who I have immeasurable respect for, once put this very well. If you happen to know Alex Groba, he said there's no export controls if there's no exports. And I think that really sums it up, right? We don't have a job if there's no business.
That's good.
And maybe to then add on to this, I heard some really great business best practices in terms of this idea of training out, right? One of the things that I've heard recommended is go to your finance team, go to your sales team, and have them walk you through what are the top 3 to 5 sales deals that must go through this year to meet their cash flow goals. And you say, okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. These 5 things must happen. So for those 5 things, you say, okay, if we're going to achieve that, I need to know what are the trade compliance implications for this so I can get ahead of it now, so that 6 months from now, I'm not slowing those things down. So we always, tell the sales team, oh, come to us in advance, blah, blah, blah. But they're busy too. So sometimes it's good to go out there and say to them, what are your top priorities? How can I help you achieve them? So if there's going to be a trade compliance process, tell me now so that I can make sure that that is the only thing my guys are working on, right? I want my team prioritizing these top 5 things to make sure that we help meet the business needs. And if there's delays, if there's process issues, it's not going to happen on those top 5. And it sounds so obvious when we say it out loud, but it never really clicked in my head until Beth Ann suggested this, that I was like, wait a minute, every trade compliance officer should know what the top 5 deals are for their company. And I think you're absolutely right. And this goes to culture as well, because once you understand what those priorities are, the culture helps make a lot more sense. So I would say those are kind of the 2 takeaways. I take no credit for any of this wisdom, but yeah, the first is there's no export controls if there's no exports, and second, you must be able at all times to state what the top priorities of your business organization are if you're going to help them succeed.
And to understand this company's culture, the top priority business, you need to be really into your company, right? You don't have to work in silo, which is one of the biggest risk you can have when you work as a trade compliance manager in-house. Simple question. Short question, but difficult question. How, from your views, companies could ensure that their trade compliance program are really integrated within the overall business operations and not being like separated or a separate function that, as we all know, can create basically execution problems?
Yeah, you have to have a holistic data oversight because the data can communicate even if people don't. Because don't get me wrong, I think having everybody at the table to have chats and catch-ups and discuss goals, it's still important. You need to have that network communication. But I always compare this to, watching one of these New York police shows, right? Whereas the viewer, you see that the fire department has one piece of evidence and the police department has another and the FBI has another. And as the viewer, it drives you crazy because you're like, guys, like this is the answer, but they don't know that that's relevant. And so if I'm talking to someone from my ethics and compliance department, they might be sitting on information that's super interesting for me. And if I ask them about certain things, that it may not occur to them that that little piece of information is actually super critical for trade compliance. And we see this also, especially between the customs organizations and the export controls organizations, because sometimes they're separate. Customs is usually a little bit more operational, a little bit more logistical focused. Export controls sanctions tends to be a little bit more legal leaning. So they're maybe looking at different things. Now, if I'm the export controls or sanctions professional, I don't necessarily want to see all the customs stuff every day, but I definitely need to be aware if there's any risk indicators in HS code changes, because that could affect Russia sanctions, for example, or vice versa. So this is really where my best practice recommendation here is, yes, we need people to talk to each other, but what we really need is the data to talk to each other so that I'm going to be informed when something that's relevant for me occurs, even if someone doesn't call me.
I have one last question, and I think this one we may have to be concise because I think you can take 1 hour to answer it. It's a more philosophical question, if I may, about how, from your views, trade compliance will be in the coming years, right? It's always a difficult question. I don't know if it's a relevant question because we cannot predict the future, and the idea is how to shape a strong, like you mentioned, resilient organization now for the future, because we are farmers. Let's not forget about it. But if you had to share to the audience a bit your ideas of what's coming, how potentially also you take that into consideration right now with within your position, in your position, and how this would affect the companies. Sorry with this very large question to conclude, but I would like to get from you all your very broad experience, your views on that.
So I think the future of trade compliance, despite the emotional challenges of being in the industry right now, is very bright. because we are getting a lot more support from our leadership. Maybe it doesn't always feel like support. It often feels like demands at the moment. But with that, I think comes a lot of opportunities. So I think the number one thing companies must be doing to keep up, as I've said, is you have to be data driven. We can't just sit there and say, oh, we have bad data, we can't do anything anymore. We must be very informed about our business. Our decision making needs to be data driven. Our programs need to be data driven because that's going to allow us the resilience to keep up. And I think, for example, what we do with advanced data analytics, of course, I think it's really cool. But what gets me really excited about this work is all of the doors that get opened after we have programs like this. Once you have that information, once you have that oversight, once you have the ability to prioritize really with a risk-based approach where you're putting your resources and make strategic plans for improvement, suddenly we now have trade compliance officers that are adding a whole lot of value to their organizations. They can now work on building trust with the business. They can help with strategic investment decisions at the C-suite level because they actually have information to influence those discussions. They can be good partners and stewards of the business. So I think for me, that's where when I look at the future and kind of what is the next generation of trade compliance looking like, I think we're going to see a lot of really quick-minded people who are advancing the business, who are strategic thinkers, who leverage data, and who are really taking their businesses forward in terms of building business resilience.
And I love ending on these very positive notes. It's a good reminder that despite all the challenges around us, we are working in an incredible field, right? And I think let's conclude on this very positive note. Thank you so much, Erika, for joining me today. Thanks to everyone listening. Do not hesitate to show some love on Spotify, please, and see you in the next episode.
Thank you so much, Nicolas.